Thank you for worshiping and just engaging in God's presence that He promised to be here. Well, we are wrapping up our summer series we've just been calling Stories, and I have thoroughly enjoyed digging into some of these old stories and may even revisit something like this next summer. And so we're going to wrap it up with a very familiar story, but maybe we can take a little different perspectives on it and see some characters from a different light today. We're going to talk about the woman at the well. And let me just kind of set up the story for you. If you didn't grow up in church and you don't know a whole lot about this story, this woman chose to get her water at noon, and let's just own it for what it was. The women in that day were the ones who went and got the water. It's just the way it was. And so I found it interesting, too, that it wasn't just the well in her community. It was actually the well outside. It was in a whole nother community. So not only was she dodging the gossiping women around her, that's no shot at anybody. It's just the reality of we're going to find out her past and all the kind of stuff. She didn't want to open up Facebook, right, and see what everybody's saying. She didn't want to see that. She didn't want to be part of it. She was an outcast in her community. So she was not only dodging the other women at the time of, in the morning time when it was cooler in the day, and that's when they fetched the water. She waited until noontime to go get her water, but not just at the well in her community, but in a whole other well in another community itself. I believe by divine appointment, Jesus was waiting at the well. Aren't you glad? I'm not going to preach here too long, but aren't you glad that when you met Jesus, those of you who are Jesus followers, you met Him, and it wasn't of your own doing. It was because Jesus planned to be there at that intersection in your life. And so I truly believe that by divine appointment, Jesus planned ahead of time. Remember, if you know the story, at least the setup, they were kind of going to go through, around typically Samaria because they didn't get along with them. And so instead of going around, He said, we're going to go through. And even His disciples said, are you sure? We don't want to go through that neighborhood. Essentially what they were saying. He said, no, we're going to go through it. And I believe because He knew who He was going to meet that day. Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other. It's just the way it was. There's a few debates on why that was, but it really was about the Jews felt like they were God's chosen people, and they were, but they got a little filled with pride. The Samaritans were a mixed race, and so for them, they were impure, and it was not just a spiritual thing, but unfortunately, it was a racist thing. And let me just say this, is there any place for being discriminatory and even racist as a God follower? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So these Samaritans and these Jews didn't get along because of this debate of where they worship, who they worship, the color of your skin, where your lineage began, and all this kind of thing. And then Jesus, being a Jewish man and a rabbi, would have been discouraged, much less requesting some kind of water from a bucket or a cup or whatever this woman was using, and this Samaritan woman and this woman with a dark past. He would have been discouraged by even talking to her and allowing her to serve him in some way. And so this kind of paints a picture of what Jesus and even His disciples are going to kind of walk back into. And so we're going to pick up our story. We've got a good bit of reading here. So John chapter 4, begin in verse 6. And if I didn't give you enough time to find it, here it is on the screen. Okay. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, please give me a drink. And that was the first protocol He broke. He was alone at the time because His disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. She said to Jesus, you are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink? She recognized, hey, this doesn't feel right, doesn't seem right. Why are you talking to me? Verse 10, Jesus replied, if you only knew the gift God has for you and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. But sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket, she said, and this well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, do you think that you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? And how can you offer better water than he and his sons," and I like how she threw, "and his animals enjoyed?" So basically, the water that was good enough for Jacob and his family and also his animals are better than the water you speak of. Do you think there's a little jab because she's a Samaritan and he's a Jew? I do believe that. Verse 13. Jesus replied, "Anyone who drinks this water will soon become thirsty again. But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life." "Please, sir," the woman said, "give me this water." It sounds pretty good at this point. "And then I'll never be thirsty again." She's still thinking literally. "And I won't have to come here to get water." So she's thinking, this will fix the outside of me. I won't have to go and dodge all the people in my community. I won't have to go to this well anymore. Okay, so you're telling me there's a water, and all I have to do is drink it, and I go back and I don't get thirsty again. Done and done. I don't have to leave home. I don't have to be bothered with all this anymore. So again, she's thinking literally. And don't we sometimes approach God? We assume that God is saying, "I want to save you. I want to give you life. I want to give you peace. I want to give you eternal life. I want to give you this. I want to give you that." And then all of a sudden, we think it's just all about, "God, fix all of my problems. Fix all of my circumstances." But Jesus was not talking about, "I'm going to fix everything around you. I'm going to do something within you." It isn't that much more important and much more satisfying than what we try to fix ourselves. Verse 16, "Go and get your husband," Jesus told her. "I don't have a husband," the woman replied, and this is where it gets really awkward. Jesus said, "You're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth." "Sir," the woman said, "you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship?" Another jab. While we Samaritans claim it is here at Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshipped." And there you have the great debate that divided ultimately the Jews and the Samaritans of, this is our place of worship. You're not really worshiping unless you worship here. Can we throw in like churches today? Like, if you're not doing it this way, if you're not playing this music, if you're not worshiping this, if you're not sitting in a pew, you've got to be sitting in a chair. You know, we debate on all this stuff, where we go to church, where our membership is, or even we're even a member at all. What are we approaching at least worship? How do we define it, and where do we have it? Verse 21, Jesus begins to blow this all up. Jesus replied, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem." So he's saying, it doesn't matter. It's not going to matter moving forward. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him. Now, was Jesus taking a jab? No. He wasn't taking a jab. He's trying to help understand, you think you know, you're missing. You're thinking it's a place. And he's saying the Jews think it's a place. And so he says, for salvation comes through the Jews. And he wasn't saying it's for the Jews alone. Pay attention to the words here. He was saying it's through the Jews. It's through the lineage, because that's how God started in the Old Testament. He said, that's the people. Those are the people that I'm going to send my Messiah, my Son, through. And so he wasn't saying to save the Jews and that Jews are the only ones that get it. It's just coming through. He was the one who was coming. But the time is coming, indeed, it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Don't you love that? And I'm sure it's already up on the screen. You know where we're going, right? Then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. Can you imagine? This conversation, it took me a while to read it, much less. Can you be there in this conversation that's happening? Can you imagine just the debate that's kind of going back? Can you imagine? I don't think that when he made her kind of own up to her situation in life, I don't think she went right into talking about something else. I think that lingered for a while. I think it sat there for a while. I think it was some healthy tension. And let me just say, we better be God-led before we drop a bombshell like that. We better have a relationship. So when we challenge you at the end of this thing to go out and be a witness, you better have a relationship before you bring some loving truth before somebody. And Jesus, of course, had that. He didn't want to waste time. He knew the appropriate time. He knew how to do it. Well, you kind of lead this conversation that he's having, and she leaves her bucket there at the well. She runs back all the way to her community. And if you kind of read it for yourself, she goes and she talks to these other men. And I imagine, were some of these other men that she had a past with. And all of a sudden she begins to witness, and she begins to say, hey, come, let me show you this guy who changed my life. So here's some lessons from the woman at the well. If you're waiting to take notes, here's your opportunity. Number one, we serve a great God. That seems so simple, but I think sometimes it's good for us to kind of go back to the basics and just, okay, we serve a great God. We serve a good Father, as we've already sang about this morning. Notice how Jesus looks at this woman. Do you believe that Jesus knew all about this woman when he woke up that morning? I believe it was part of the conversation. I believe those conversations with his father went something like this in the morning, every morning with Jesus and his dad. I think it went something like this. Dad, man, this world's worse than I thought. I'm going to need you today, but man, there's so many good things out there. There's people with so much potential, and these guys, in fact, that you asked me to call out, they were not really well liked, but yet they're getting it, Dad. They're getting it. So where do we want to go to? We're going around Samaria today. So no, I want you to go through Samaria. Well, why would we go through Samaria? Because, you're setting me up to have this conversation with my disciples, and they're not going to like it. And no, go through the Samaria. And here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a woman there. And just like you called these guys out of their mess, you're going to have an opportunity to minister to this woman who's an outcast in her community. And let me just tell you, here's a rap sheet. I would think that that's kind of the relationship and intimacy God the Father and God the Son had on a daily basis. And Jesus left his little quiet time, and he goes, guys, here we go. And he's sitting there waiting at the well on this woman to show up. And when she shows up, he could have, and he was justified in looking at her with judgment and condemnation. He should have and could have ignored her, and it wouldn't have been awkward. What was awkward for her is when he engaged her in conversation. So what if we're supposed to approach the world and the people around us that way? We think, well, I don't want to offend. We think, I don't want to hurt. I don't want to. We don't have to bring up her past like he did, but we can at least engage in a conversation, and that's what caused her to open up. It was simply when he just looked at her and requested, a Samaritan woman requested something from her, to use her bucket to drink from, to use her ladle to drink from, her being unclean and him being super clean. Just by him saying, can I have some of your water? She immediately dropped her walls down and says, man, you want something from me? You're asking what I think? Every man, I don't think this is a blanket statement and me making any assumptions. Every man in her life sought to get something from her and devalued her as a woman and as a human. And for maybe the first time, Jesus, a Jewish man, a rabbi, she would come to realize, is now treating her as a person, is respecting her, is loving her. Jesus, just a couple years later, hung on a cross. And on that cross, he was saying to every outcast, to every person who had a past that they were so embarrassed about they didn't know where to turn and where to go. Who would love me? What God out there would love me? Not the God of the Old Testament that's constantly judging and making all these rules, and the Pharisees that are coming along and they're overseeing this thing that we're calling not the church yet, but that's all they had to go to God, and they're facing all this judgment, facing all these rules, and they're never living up to it. And all of a sudden Jesus comes along and he's hanging on the cross and says, "Forgive the ones who put me up here." This blood is for, it's a cheesy old song back in the 80s, right? Can you hear Carmen singing it, those who grew up in church like me? This blood is for you. It really is for you. We serve a great God who loves us right where we are. Number 2, Jesus loved meeting people where they were. He wasn't trying to lead them before they were ready to move. He loved to meet them right where they are. And I want you to see the contrast. It's something for you to look into this week. There's Nicodemus in chapter 3, and then there's this Samaritan woman right now in chapter 4. And let me just point out a quick difference. Nicodemus is an example of the truth that no one can rise so high as to be above the need for salvation. If you don't know much about Nicodemus, here's all you need to know. He was a Pharisee. He was a guy who had it all together. Everyone looked to him, assumed that he had it all together, but yet in the dark, without anyone knowing about it, he was sneaking around, having visits and having encounters and conversations with Jesus about life, about what he was preaching about. And he had all these conversations without anyone knowing about it. And Jesus had all these conversations and loving this man and leading this man. And what it shows us when he eventually, a long journey for him to give his life to Jesus. But eventually he did. It shows us that, hey, you're not too good. You're not too powerful. You're not so good that you appear to have it all together that you don't need Jesus in your life. The Samaritan, in contrast, this woman is an example of the truth that no one can sink so low as to be below the offer of salvation. Just like you can never be so good that you don't need salvation, you can never be so low, right? That God isn't saying, I'm offering you salvation. What was he doing here at this moment? What was this story? What is it showing us about the character of Jesus? Here's what I believe it's showing us. It's showing us that he's setting the tone of his earthly ministry. And what I mean by that, he's going out to all these multitudes and all these people, and every time the community hears that he's coming to preach, what happens? He draws a crowd, right? Even some of the stories we've talked about, the woman with the issue of bleeding, she had to fight through what, right? She couldn't make an appointment. She couldn't get to Jesus for a lot of different reasons, but she broke through the crowd. So we know that he even fed 5,000 men, and so they didn't count women and children in that time, at least in the numbers. That was just an issue they had. So let's just kind of talk about what the real number was. You're talking about 10, maybe 15,000 people that he fed with just a snack lunch. So all these people, he's performing miracles and he's having all this success, if you want to look at it that way. He's drawing a huge crowd, but we really don't see a lot of testimonies, a lot of impact that we can see from the crowds. What we do see, though, is every encounter he has, which is the power behind these stories that we're working through, every time that he impacts someone for eternity, it happens when he sits down with them face to face. When he just meets them right where they are. Not talking to a broad audience, but talking to them one-on-one. Now, what that doesn't mean is he didn't see the value in the crowd. He preached for hours, the Sermon on the Mount. It's just, 3 chapters essentially, but we're talking about hours. So he understood the value of it. There's value in this, what we're doing today. But if we're really going to see lives change, if we're really going to impact people where we live, we have to get down to the one-on-one conversation, the face-to-face. We've got to get out of the pew and go and get into a circle. Go and get on a couch somewhere. Go somewhere and build relationships with people who need Jesus. He engaged this woman in conversation, and we can actually watch the development of her faith and as she begins to kind of see Jesus through it. Now, in this conversation, we're going to lead you through it. In verse 11, she calls him sir. So right off the bat, she says, sir. It's just kind of out of respect. And then all of a sudden, in verse 19, he kind of calls her out on something, right, knows something about her. Then she addresses him as a prophet. And then we fast forward to 25, she's discussing the idea of understanding something he's saying. There's some kind of something that's clicking within her that thinks, you know what, there's a Messiah that I've heard about. And she starts talking about the Messiah. So she begins to understand because of this encounter that, you know what, this reminds me of what I've heard about a Messiah. And then we go all the way to verse 29 when she's back in her community and she's actually telling people, and he says, I believe that the Messiah is here. We think sometimes that we're going to have one conversation, we're going to make one statement, and someone's going to get it. But in fact, the way transformation happens in relationships, instead of us just committing to the broad ministry and that being it, we've got to understand that if Jesus saw the value in the crowd, but then he also saw the value in a small number of 12 men, and then if you want to shrink it down to his inner circle, he would call it, and then he kind of even had these encounters with people, and he pulled them away, and he had these talks with her. Are we not expected to approach ministry and help people work through what they're going through like that? There are people in our lives who need to hear about Jesus. And it's good that we invite them to church. We need to do that. Some of you are here today because somebody invited you to church. There's power in that. But the way that we're going to make that lasting impression is when they hopefully do come to church, we're going to have a follow-up with them. We can't just cast out a broad net. We've got to be specific. So that leads us to our third point, our last point today. Our story impacts lives only when we share it. This woman leaves her bucket. She returns to her community to share what has happened. In fact, she changed, this whole community has changed to the most likely or at least unlikely person. And what I want to say to you, as you're kind of hopefully not putting your stuff up, don't lose me here. I want you to see something. As you're sharing your story, because that's the whole idea. We hear about these stories, we read about these stories in the Bible, but we are telling a story as well. We are living out our story right now. So I want to give you a couple of pointers as you're living it out. One, let me just say, if you've never recorded your story, I think it's vital for you to kind of write it out and record it. Put it somewhere, not just for yourself to be reminded, but also for the generations behind. Wouldn't you love for that to be something you leave for your kids and grandkids? They may not know your whole story. They may not want to know all the skeletons, and you can be vague, right? But just something where they can read and say, hey, I did not know that. So real quickly, our story should give God the glory, not us. Our story should give God the glory. Not, it wasn't our goodness, and it's not our goodness that makes us good. It's Him. Our story should be more about how good God is rather than how bad we were. You've grown up in church. If you have, you understand. You've heard those testimonies. They spent 10 minutes telling how bad they were. And then 10 seconds to say, and then God saved me. Amen? Our story should be constantly updated to reflect what God is doing in me recently. If my story, it ends 10 years ago, I need to update that. Or I need to question, am I allowing God to work in me recently? In fact, our story should have two main parts. Our identity, how we were saved, and then our progress. What is He doing in us now? So why living water? Why living water? Why would He use this? I think it goes deeper than just Him talking about water because He's at a literal water well. I think it's broader than that. I think He was not saying that you drink this one time and you're good. You don't need to grow. You don't need to, nourishment. He's not saying. He's using water because she would have understood and they would have understood that water was essential to survival. And it wasn't just one bucket. It wasn't just one sip. It was a daily visit to the well. So let me just say that because I'm your pastor and this is what I'm supposed to say. So I'm going to say it and then we're going to move on quickly, just like a Band-Aid. Sunday gathering cannot be your only well that you visit. So what are the barriers? If we're supposed to live out, to be the living water and let his water and his worship go through us, what would be the barriers for that? I think sometimes maybe we go to the wrong wells. What are those wrong wells? I think it's anywhere we go to get filled other than Jesus. What does that look like? Let's get specific. We look for our satisfaction, our validation, and our worth in maybe a variety of things like money. Maybe you have money and you feel like, I'm worth this because I'm worth this. Or you don't have any money, you say, I'm not worth anything because I don't have anything. You think about relationships. This relationship isn't going well, so I'm not good. This person doesn't like me, so I'm not valuable. I need validation. I need everybody to like me. And that was one of the first lessons I had to learn as a pastor. Is not everybody's going to like every decision. Not everybody's going to like you. Not everybody's going to like your style of preaching. Nobody's going to like the way you dress. Even if you wear a tie, you take the tie off. Somebody's not going to like that. Somebody's going to be intimidated by it. You know what I'm saying? We could go on and on. Everybody's not going to like you, even if you're in it for all the right reasons. Respect. You feel like you're not getting respect, so you feel like I'm not doing the right thing. I don't have any value with Jesus and success. However you define success, you say, I have all these achievements and all these awards. I've accomplished all this in this season of life. And you feel like, man, I'm this and God is blessing me. And all of a sudden the seasons change and you're not getting recognized. You're not getting that promotion. You're not getting that. And then all of a sudden you feel like God is failing you. You see what I'm saying? If we're constantly going to the well that is in the world, if we're constantly going to people and other things and trying to get filled with what the world has to offer, we're going to leave feeling empty. Ryan offered this for me this week when we were working through some stuff. He gave me this. He said, the wrong wells are places we keep hoping will fix us or make us feel safe or fill us up. And I love this part. Wrong wells are almost addictive, because they seem to settle our unsettled lives for a moment. Think about addictions. Think about what that looks like. It's all about me covering up and masking some hurt or some stress. If I can just do this to just forget about it momentarily, then that's my fix. Ephesians 1:23 says, and the church is his body. It is made full and complete by Christ, who fills all things everywhere with himself. Jesus is the living water. Jesus is the living water who we go to for salvation. We go to be sanctified. We go to constantly. And I want us to kind of picture as I wrap this up. One of my church moms let me borrow this antique bucket. Is this not legit? This is a legit bucket. Some of you are wanting to buy it, but I'll tell you who to talk to. I want you to think about, you go, the idea is you go and you fill this bucket and I don't know what you fill it with. You fill it with God's love and his worship. Let's just say you came here today. You're here, and hopefully today you leave here and you're not worse than when you came. That's what we hope. But you come here and you're filled with, living water. You're filled with hope because of fellowship and worship and hopefully a little bit of dab of preaching and that sort of thing. And so you fill it up. But inevitably, what's going to happen when you leave here today? Your bucket's filled with living water, with God's love and his peace and his life. But somebody may leave here, let's say a family, and you leave here, Dad, you're driving, and all of a sudden the two kids in the back get into this spat. He touched me. She looked at me. What happened to that bucket of living water in that moment? It got bumped, right? I mean, if I bump this thing, I did not put water in it because I love this person and it's antique, okay? So I bumped that. There's water, it's going to spill out. let's say tomorrow you have the most Monday-est Monday ever. Is it okay to make up words? So you have that, and then all of a sudden what happens to some of that water? It gets bumped and some spills out. And then Tuesday, we could go on, and you know your life. I know mine. And eventually we get through Wednesday. If you're lucky, you get through Wednesday, and there's a drop of water in that bucket. There's a drop. You look hard, you can see it. But if you're depending on this, you're coming in every Sunday, you're like, man, I got to fill me up. Please. See, the idea is that we don't just depend on this to fill this, to fill this. It has to be something we're engaged in daily. It's reading our Bible for the point of transformation, not learning stuff, just being transformed. It's praying. It's listening to God. It's serving. It's being the best human we can be. Whatever title you carry, mom, dad, spouse, whatever it is. The idea is that we have this bucket, and it's in here, and there's nothing we can do to keep it filled on our own. Only God can fill it. So are we filling our bucket, or are we walking around bumping into people? And all of a sudden what happens, I would think, that when someone needs to come to us, because that's the idea here, when someone needs to lean on us to share our living water with them, but yet we've used up all of our water and we're not being refilled, eventually we're going to become one of those dry wells. Just this morning, God kind of showed me something. I promise I'm wrapping up this, and I promise on this one, okay? But here's the idea. When you think about this bucket, when you think about the well, we think, because everything's easily accessed, you may go to a restaurant today and you get your cup and you press that and it fills up and you go and you drink and you come back. But that's not how a well works. And I would think that Jesus understood that. A well works that you come and you drop the bucket and then you have to lower it and then you have to raise it, right? There's this idea of waiting, and there's this idea of effort. We want God, we want to just show up. And we'll say, God, I'm here for my God time. I opened up my app. I read my verse of the day. Are we good? Good, good. I'm good. Let me go. But that's not being filled. That's not the idea we're talking about. How often, if we can get real, how often are you going to the well that is God on a daily basis and sitting there quietly and saying, God, I need you. Fill me with your word. Fill me with some worship. Fill me, because if I'm going to be worth anything to you out there, I've got to make time and show you that you are valued more than that to me. Is it a priority for you to worship him daily? We see the value in it, but do we plan it out? Do we say, nothing is stopping me from doing this, because this is the most important thing I can do today? Will you bow your heads with me? God, I love you. And I pray that you would show us if there's anything within us that is causing us to go seek the wrong well for what only you can offer us. Then God, show it to us. Are we seeking the approval of people more than your approval? Are we chasing after success rather than just being satisfied with what you have for us and who we are in you? Are we trying to build our schedules so busy? Are we struggling, and this is me, are we struggling to just be still because we're so active? We are so involved in so many things that it is a struggle for us to sit down and just be with you. God, show us. We truly want to be filled with you. If you're here today and you don't know Jesus, that's where it begins. Maybe God had a conversation with you today and your heart is just racing and you know that you need Him. You've been trying the world, you've been trying everything else, but you know that and they left you empty. It's time to turn to Jesus today. Anyone here, just lift your hand if you want to invite Jesus into your life today. Anyone.